So I'm very pleased in this interview to be able to introduce you to Dr. Deborah Mayhew. Dr. Mayhew is a real pioneer in the field, and that's saying something given how big our field is at the moment. But believe it or not, it was started by a small handful of people, and Dr. Mayhew is one of those people that was there at the very beginning. Dr. Mayhew has written 3 books on usability. The most influential is The Usability Engineering Lifecycle, and one of my favourites is one that she co-edited with Randolph Bias, and this is the book. It's called Cost Justifying Usability. If you're ever called upon to cost justify your work, this is absolutely the textbook that you need. Dr. Mayhew has been working in the field of usability now for over 30 years. She's got a wealth of experience, a lot of that spent usability testing, and I know you're going to get a lot out of this particular session. So to begin with, Deborah, I've been following your work for some time, but some people watching this video may not be aware of your background and your experience and expertise. So to begin with, could you talk a little bit about your background, how you got into the field and so on?
Hi, David. Thanks for inviting me to participate in your course. I've been working in UX since 1980, which is pretty much as long as the field has existed. While I was working towards my PhD in experimental cognitive psychology in the late 70s, I took a summer job as a programmer in a software company. I got so interested in software development, not to mention in making a real salary, that I stayed in the job full-time, and I finished my PhD on the side. And that dual background in cognitive psychology and software development served me well when the field of software usability was just emerging in the early 1980s. After my PhD, I worked as a usability engineer in some large corporations, but I soon got frustrated with big company culture, so I moved back to academia, teaching computer-human interaction courses in a computer science college. But frankly, that was even more frustrating, so I set up my consulting practice in 1986. If not the first, then I'm sure I was at least one of the first independent consultants in software usability back then. I've written several books and book chapters, and I've done a lot of teaching over my career at professional conferences and training events, and in-house in corporations. And recently, like you, I've started publishing online courses. And a big part of my consulting practice has indeed been conducting formal usability tests.
One question I often get from students is how to make UX happen in their organisation when they don't have a dedicated UX team or much of a budget. It's my view that usability testing is a great way to start. Do you have any examples of people building UX teams on the back of usability testing?
Oh, absolutely. One of my first jobs in UX was at Wang Labs. This was in the early 1980s. I had a colleague there named Carrie Ehrlich, who not only had usability skills, but also astute organizational skills. Carrie single-handedly created, grew, and managed a sizable usability department at Wang that was more effective and had more impact than many do today. The way she accomplished this was very clever and remains one of my favorite stories from these early days. Without anyone's permission, Carrie decided to run a usability test on a major new release of Wang's flagship office automation product. This was probably the first ever usability test done at Wang. It was carried out after the product was publicly announced, but just before it was released. Carrie managed to talk several very high-level vice presidents into serving as test users. As she knew what happened, they all failed miserably to figure out how to do the simplest of tasks in the software. For the first time, the management team at Wang grasped the importance of the user interface in a very visceral way. Virtually overnight, Carrie was assigned to report directly to one of these vice presidents. With this level of support, she quickly grew a usability department and integrated usability into Wang's product development departments. I've never forgotten this lesson in the power of usability testing when strategically applied. Usability testing doesn't just impact products, it can impact entire organizations and their methodologies too.
So, Deborah, many people think you need to rent a dedicated usability lab to run a usability test, and because they're expensive, that often puts people off testing. What's your view on the need for usability labs?
Well, yeah. My general feeling is that field testing can yield much more valid and reliable results than testing in a lab. One of my favorite examples of this involved a software application I was designing for the New York City Police Department in downtown Manhattan. New York City police stations are among the craziest work environments I have ever been in. They're typically one big open room filled with cops coming and going, and the public hanging around waiting, with babies crying and boomboxes playing. They're shabby, they're poorly lit, they're usually not air-conditioned. It can be in the high 90s and humid in August. Cops might bring in psychotic and violent prisoners into the station in the middle of the night and would need to enter data in this application while handcuffed to them. They would be constantly interrupted while trying to do their tasks by both the antics of their prisoners and by other cops and their supervisors. It's hard to imagine a more stressful and distracting work environment in which to use a software application. So when it came time to test my user interface design, we brought our prototype into a police station on a laptop, and we did our testing right there, in the middle of all that chaos. It would have made no sense at all to have tested that application in the controlled environment of a usability lab. Even if every other aspect of the usability test was properly designed and conducted, that alone would have completely invalidated any data we collected.
So it sounds like on some of your projects, Deborah, you've run usability tests of stuff that you've designed. I've heard some people argue that you shouldn't test your own designs because you might be biased. What's your view?
No, I don't buy that. The formal usability testing technique that our field has evolved is fundamentally based on the scientific method. The scientific method is designed to provide controls for avoiding bias. Scientists always test their own hypotheses and generally manage to avoid bias through proper methodology. And similarly, user interface designers should be able to test their own designs, so long as they're well schooled in how to conduct a usability test to yield unbiased, valid, and reliable results. In fact, when I'm the lead user interface designer on a project, I prefer to test my own designs. And that's because it's in the very process of design that we bump up against what is most challenging to design well, and what design decisions we have least confidence in. As the designer, we are intimate with every detail of a design, and we have unique insight into what needs to be tested and how to interpret what we observe during testing. And it's also true that everything I learn from testing my own designs makes me a better designer. Designers who never test don't benefit from this feedback loop.
So, do you normally test completed designs, or do you ever test early prototypes?
Well, I do both. It's always good to test early, but early prototypes can be challenging to test. One I did was particularly challenging. This was a usability test of a proposed redesign of a fire alarm system. The system was designed for large campuses like hotels and hospitals. There was a central control panel for first responders that reported the location of activated alarms and allowed them to perform certain actions, like turn off the alarms and sprinkler systems. The proposed new user interface of this control panel consisted of a small display area that allowed just a few lines of text. There were also a set of lights that could be in different states, different alarm sounds, which varied in frequency and pulse rate, and an array of buttons for taking actions. The budget didn't allow for any kind of working prototype early on, but we did want to test before going further. So I had to design a paper prototype and a testing procedure that would yield some kind of meaningful insights. As a base, I had a layout on paper of the blank screen, all the buttons, and the lights in the off state. Then I overlaid the blank screen area with changing text messages. I had paper symbols that represented individual lights as on or blinking, and I swapped these in and out in reaction to user interactions. Finally, I had two independent alarm sound generators that I also had to turn off and on in response to user actions. And as well as having to simulate the prototype's every reaction to user input, I also had to moderate and take notes. Fortunately, I already had decades of testing experience when I did this test, and I was actually able to pull it off. I probably didn't get as much useful data as I might have with a fully functioning live prototype, but I certainly got more insights than I would have without testing at all.
So Deborah, it sounds like you typically do your testing outside of labs and without assistants or observers. Do you prefer to work alone on usability test projects?
No, not at all. It's true that it can be a challenge to control observers when they're not behind one-way glass. But overall, I do prefer to have them present during my tests. And that's because it helps ensure that my findings will actually have an impact on the product. Here's an example. I once tested a website to allow doctors to look up drug information online. I wasn't involved in the design. I was just brought in to plan and run a usability test on a live prototype. When I ran the test, the front-end developer and the graphic designer observed all the test sessions. Halfway through the testing, we all got together and discussed what we had seen so far. I would identify a usability issue we had all observed and give an interpretation of what the source of the problem was. Then the graphic designer would suggest alternatives, and together we would agree on a redesign to solve the problem. The graphic designer and front-end developer then quickly implemented these changes, and we incorporated them into later test sessions. What was so unusual about this is that I never collated any data, and I never wrote a report. We were testing as a team, all observing the same things, and acting on our observations almost immediately, so there was no need to document anything. In addition, we all had clear roles, different skills, and mutual respect, and so we were able to work on this very collaborative and agile manner together. This is the potential value of having other team members observe testing sessions. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work. It requires small teams of highly collaborative and dedicated team members with different skill sets and mutual respect. But it was wonderful to see how things could actually work when all the conditions were right. As for assistance, as in my example with the fire alarm system, it can be challenging to run a usability test by yourself. In the past, I've used assistants to control a prototype, moderate a test, or collect data, but I've never been particularly happy with the results. It can be hard to decipher someone else's notes, and sometimes important data isn't captured. Well, that's okay if I have a video of test sessions, but it means I have to watch the video, so I might as well not have had an assistant in the first place. If we share moderating across test users, I often find the other person doesn't work the way I do, and this introduces noise into the data. So, given how much experience I have doing testing at this point, I guess I prefer to do it all myself. However, I am always happy to have an apprentice working alongside me to learn the ropes. I just don't rely on them to take full responsibility for parts of the testing process.
So, talking of apprentices, what's the most common mistakes you see inexperienced people make when they're usability testing?
Well, actually, I have an article available on my website called Usability Testing, You Get What You Pay For, that addresses this topic. The article describes a number of areas where I've seen untrained and inexperienced usability testers go wrong. But here's just one example that has to do with interpreting data. Interpreting test data is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of usability testing. And this is where I think you really need a background in cognitive psychology. In one test I conducted, the data showed that many users clicked on an incorrect button. My assistant's interpretation was that the button needed a new and clearer label, but my analysis was different. I recognized that the page looked too similar to another page that had different functionality. In my view, users were confused about which page they were on and what they were doing. So a change in button labeling would not really have solved the underlying problem, which was perceptual in nature. Personally, I think the two most important backgrounds for being able to effectively interpret usability testing data are a background in cognitive psychology and some experience actually doing user interface design. Many usability testers today have neither in their background and experience, and I think this limits their ability to make sense out of their data.
So, as well as the article you've mentioned, what other resources would you recommend to people who want to become skilled at usability testing?
Well, my 1999 book, The Usability Engineering Lifecycle, offers a detailed explanation of usability testing, including templates for testing materials. Actually, there are quite a few books out there at this point dedicated to usability testing, as a search on Amazon will turn up. My online course, Designing for Productivity in the User Experience, includes a segment on testing for ease of use or productivity, which is different in important ways from testing for ease of learning and intuitiveness. I guess I would suggest that people who want to learn usability testing skills take any courses they can find and read everything they can find, and then try to apprentice to an experienced tester, observing them and then practicing under their supervision. There's a fair amount of science to it, but a fair amount of art too. It's a skill you need to learn about through reading and training, but then just get supervised experience with. Consultants like you and I can provide coaching and mentoring if you don't have any experts in-house to apprentice with.
Deborah, that's been extremely valuable. Thanks again for your time. By the way, where can people get in contact with you?
My pleasure, David. I've sent you a document to include in your course that provides my contact information, as well as links to my online courses, books, articles, and websites.